keep learning the Tom Daniel Show. Keep listening, keep learning the Tom Daniel Show.
You're listening to The Tom Daniel Show, and I'm your host, Tom Daniel. All right, so when you think Delta Blues, that iconic origin story of Robert Johnson meeting the devil at the Crossroads in Mississippi always comes to mind. I mean, that's probably the single most powerful myth in all of American music, isn't it? At the heart of the story is the burning question of how Robert Johnson, who was just an average okay blues man, suddenly transformed into a legend, seemingly overnight. How did he do it? How did he become so good so fast? The truth, however, might not involve either the devil or even Mississippi. Today on the Tom Daniel Show, we traveled down to Grady, Alabama, a quiet settlement 20 miles south of Montgomery in Montgomery County, and it's surrounded by red clay fields and longleaf pines. My wife's first cousin lives in Grady, along with his wife, and next door to her mother. Grady is such a peaceful little country place. I've been there many times, as my wife's cousin brews the most awesome cup of coffee anywhere and plays the meanest bass guitar of anybody. And also his wife serves the most incredible eggnog I've ever had in my life. And, even when we visit in the summer, I still request it. I once installed and set up an irrigation system for her hostas, and she paid me an eggnog. Now, I came out way ahead on that deal. So awesome. Anyway, life is slow in Grady. There's a lot of farmlands and hayfields, and rising up over the whole community is the tall tower of WSFA, the flagship NBC affiliate in Montgomery. Now, Grady is not a place you'd expect to find one of the most mysterious chapters in American music history. Yet this small Crossroads community is tied to the very foundation of the Delta Blues. You've been told by many others, including me, that the blues came out of the Mississippi Delta. But maybe not so much. Because long before Robert Johnson became the mythic figure we know today, and the man who supposedly sold his soul to the devil at a Mississippi crossroads, he was just a beginner. He left his Mississippi home as an average blues musician and returned sometime later as an unbelievably great blues musician. Now, episode 24 of the Tom Daniel Show is devoted to the entire story of Robert Johnson at the Crossroads. And also, episode 24 of my other podcast called Requiem Radio is a ghost story I created based on that myth. Now, oddly enough, it wasn't until just now that I realized that on both of my podcasts, it's episode 24 in each case. That's weird. And Robert Johnson's teacher, by most credible accounts, was a man named Ike Zimmerman, who learned to play guitar in the graveyards of Grady, Alabama. Wait, who? Ike Zimmerman? Isaiah Ike Zimmerman was born around 1907 right there in Grady. He worked as a farmer and woodcutter, but his reputation rested on his extraordinary guitar playing. By all reports, he was a self-taught musician who practiced obsessively. So obsessively, in fact, that his neighbors took notice not just of how much he played, but where. According to family accounts and oral histories collected in the 1980s and 1990s, Ike would walk down the sandy roads at night with his guitar slung across his back and disappear into the graveyards surrounding Grady's small Baptist churches. It was Macedonia, Bethlehem, Union Grove, and there among the headstones, graves, and cedar trees, he would sit and practice for hours, often until dawn. He would say that the dead were the best audience because they never complained. Now, to most Southerners of that time, and frankly, to most people anywhere, playing music in a graveyard is a little unsettling. Now, the graveyard was sacred ground, a place of rest and reverence, not a hangout for nighttime music. But there was a practical reason for Ike's choice. As his family later explained, graveyards were among the few places a black man in rural Alabama could practice his guitar in peace. In the early 20th century South, music, especially the blues, wasn't always welcome in respectable company. It was seen by some churchgoers as the devil's music, a form of moral backsliding. Even black preachers throughout the South devoted a lot of sermon time to warning their congregation about the dangers of the blues. Yet for Ike, the graveyard offered quiet solitude and no one to complain. But the legend didn't stop there. Neighbors began to say that Ike wasn't playing alone. Children whispered that the Haints came to listen. And so began one of the great folklore currents of the blues, that it was some kind of communion between the living and the dead, between the earthly and the spiritual. And that's what makes the music sounds otherworldly. This is a theme that's going to be repeated and exploited a lot in the blues. Now, we know the rough outline of what happened next thanks to the work of blues historians like Stephen C. LeVere and Robert Conforth and Gail Dean Wardlow. Now, sometime around 1933, a young man from the Mississippi Delta named Robert Johnson arrived in Grady, Alabama. At the time, Johnson was known as a mediocre guitarist at best, admired more for his ambition really than for his ability. He just wasn't all that great. He came to Grady to seek out Ike Zimmerman specifically, who had by that time gained some fame as one of the best guitarists around. Ike took Robert Johnson under his wing and allowed him to live with the Zimmerman family for several months, possibly as long as a year, while teaching him how to play a wicked blues guitar. Now, in the music classes I teach, I always make a little joke about Robert Johnson. I say to the students, maybe he didn't make a deal with the devil at the Crossroads in order to become a phenomenal bluesman. There is another theory. I say maybe he did something else. Maybe he practiced. Well, according to the historical documents during this period in Grady, that's exactly what he did. Robert Johnson practiced relentlessly. He and Ike played together every night, often in the same graveyards where Ike had polished his own skill. Ike took Robert Johnson to the graveyards because it worked for him, so, it might work for Johnson too. The Zimmerman family's recollections, now particularly those of Ike's daughter, Laretha L.V. Zimmerman, are among the most vivid sources we have. In interviews conducted decades later, she recalled that Robert Johnson would sit on the tombstones with her father, both of them playing in the moonlight. She said they'd be out there all night long just playing. She said her mother used to yell at them, "Y'all gonna wake the dead." And that phrase, kind of half joke, half warning, captures something essential about that story. That was the birth of the legend. And you're listening to The Tom Daniels Show. We'll be right back.
What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show.
Welcome back to the Tom Daniels Show. I have to admit, I've been really excited about creating this episode for a while now because I knew that Mary Mac would totally blow my mind with the music. Mary Mac is the world's most perfect band. We've been talking about Robert Johnson's pilgrimage to Grady, Alabama to study the blues with local musician Ike Zimmerman, who taught Johnson to play while sitting on headstones in the graveyard. When Robert Johnson left Grady to go back home, his playing had changed completely. Within months, he emerged as the most technically skilled and emotionally powerful blues man in history. His recordings, just 29 songs recorded between 1936 and 1937, reshaped the blues entirely. Yet that's what also raised the question that's haunted blues history ever since. How did Robert Johnson transform so completely, so suddenly? To the people in Mississippi who heard him before and after, the change definitely seemed supernatural. And then when Johnson began performing songs like Crossroads Blues, Me and the Devil Blues, and Hellhound on My Trail, well, the myth practically wrote itself at that point. They all said that he'd met the devil at the crossroads and exchanged his soul for mastery of the blues. But the real crossroads in his life may not have even been in Mississippi at all. It might have been the Grady Crossroads, where Montgomery County Roads 1 and 28 meet not far from the graveyards where Ike Zimmerman practiced and taught Robert Johnson how to really play. It's important to understand that in the rural South of the 1930s, the line between the sacred and the supernatural was porous. Christian faith and African spiritual traditions coexisted, sometimes uneasily, but also sometimes in harmony. For many black Southerners, graveyards were not just places of mourning, but spaces of ancestral presence. Music made in a graveyard could be both prayer and invocation, entertainment and ancestral affirmation. So when people said Ike learned from the dead, that wasn't necessarily a claim of witchcraft. That was a poetic acknowledgement that he learned from those who came before him, from the ancestors, the spirits, the deep well of history buried right there in the soil of the South. And in that light, the Crossroads myth takes on a new meaning entirely. Rather than a literal signed contract deal with Satan, it becomes a story about the musician's willingness to stand at the intersection, or the crossroads, of two worlds, the intersection of the living and the dead, the sacred and the profane, the known and the mysterious, and draw music from both. Now, from a documentary standpoint, there are no known photographs of Ike Zimmerman, and only a few written references. But oral testimony from his family and community members in Grady has remained consistent. Ike Zimmerman later moved to Beauregard, Mississippi with his brother Herman, where he served as a preacher and continued to play music. He died in 1967, largely unknown outside of the blues academic and scholarship community. As for Robert Johnson, his fame grew posthumously, first through collectors like John Hammond, and later through artists who claimed his influence like Muddy Waters, Eric Clapton, Keith Richards. Each generation rediscovered the myth of the devil at the crossroads, often without knowing anything about the man behind it at all. What makes Grady so compelling is that it recenters a forgotten geography of the blues. Now, popular imagination roots the music in the Mississippi Delta, but its formative soil stretches across Alabama, Georgia, and the hill country of northern Mississippi. For poor Southern blacks, the geography, society, and culture of Dixie was the same everywhere, and it never really made logical sense to me that the blues only popped up in one part of one state. It would be so much more logical and practical for the blues to have come from everywhere equally. The blues have always been a regional conversation, not a pinpointed one. Grady, Alabama's role in this reminds us that the blues is a regional conversation and a dialogue carried by migration, kinship, and memory. If the devil was ever present in this, then he was just one participant in a much larger spiritual landscape. The more interesting truth may be that Ike Zimmerman, a self-taught guitarist from rural Alabama, gave Robert Johnson the tools that would become the very sound of the Delta Blues, and did so in the stillness of an Alabama graveyard, where even the dead could listen. Today, if you drive through Grady, there's no marker, There's no museum. There is no sign at all that a legend once passed through. But the WSFA broadcast tower still looms over the pines, and the old churchyards of Macedonia and Bethlehem still hold their watch. From time to time, local musicians and blues scholars make pilgrimages there. They stand by the cracked stones and imagine the sound of a guitar echoing through the hot Alabama night with the whippoorwills. In those echoes lies a truth that scholarship can't quite quantify, that the blues was never just about sorrow or sin, but about reaching across the boundary between what's gone and what remains. It's the music of inheritance, and Ike Zimmerman, the graveyard guitarist of Grady, Alabama, was one of its greatest teachers. The miracle of the blues wasn't supernatural. It was dedication and practice, hard, relentless practice, guided by an amazing teacher in an inspiring setting. Let me give you some great references if you'd like to learn more about Ike Zimmerman and Robert Johnson. I highly recommend Stephen LeVaire's research for the Robert Johnson estate, specifically his liner notes for the 1990 Columbia Records re-release of Robert Johnson's complete recordings. Also, you can't go wrong with the excellent Robert Johnson biography by Bruce Conforth and Gail Dean Wardlow called Up Jumped the Devil, published in 2019. Also, in issue 42 of Living Blues magazine, published in 1998, Jim O'Neill describes the life of Ike Zimmerman, which was the first time I'd ever heard of the man. And finally, I definitely invite you to explore the oral histories collected from the Zimmerman family by the Alabama Folk Life Association in Birmingham and the Alabama Center for Traditional Culture in Montgomery. And I just couldn't help myself. I also created a companion ghost story episode about the graveyard Crossroads of Grady for Requiem Radio. It's an original, fictional ghost story, but it's based on the real-life events that I just discussed. Thank you, everybody. This has been the Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening. Keep learning.
Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Take a break from your usual routine and tune into the Tom Daniels Show. You'll discover the world of melodies and stories that you might not know. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom